Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Paul Saunders. I'm the president of the Center for the National Interest. And we're very pleased this morning to have jointly with Energy Innovation Reform Project a discussion of the future of Russia's energy sector, war, sanctions, and the energy transition. I'll turn the meeting over right away to our moderator, Robin West, who many may know as Managing Director of the Boston Consulting Group's Center for Energy Impact, the founder and longtime chairman of PFC Energy, longtime chairman of two really major Washington institutions, the German Marshall Fund and the United States Institute of Peace. And also someone with deep experience in policy making in government and also in private sector investment and advice in the energy sector. So Robin, thank you for being with us this morning. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. I don't want to gloss over your qualifications and the fact that you wrote this excellent paper, which I hope everyone's read. It's an excellent basis of discussion. We have two terrific panelists, Tatiana Trova, who has tremendous experience in Russia and on the Russian petroleum sector. And importantly, she is also on the board of Schlumberger, which is the only major energy service company still active in Russia. So she has not only a brilliant theoretical perspective, but also a practical perspective of what's going on in Russia. And Craig Kennedy, who has over 30 years experience in Moscow. He opened the CIRA office. He later was a vice chairman of Bank of America Merrill Lynch. And he too has a long and really firsthand experience. So you're talking to people who don't just look at this theoretically, but really understand what's going on. So that said, let me turn the floor over first to Tatiana for some thoughts you may have.
Oh, sorry. Me first to talk briefly about.
Oh no, I'm sorry. You're absolutely right.
That's okay.
I was so eager to get to all the other ones, but
right. So
Paul, if you discuss the paper, which I think is great.
I'll talk briefly about that, and then Tatiana and Craig. So and I'll try to be very brief. It's a long paper. I can't do it justice in several minutes. I think, and again, to stress that this is a paper that I did in my role at Energy Innovation Reform Project, where I was president for many years and now a senior advisor after moving to the Center for the National Interest. In brief, I think that the Russian energy sector clearly has faced enormous pressure from the war, from U.S. and Western sanctions, and that's contributed to wider costs to the Russian economy. At the same time, however, it's a sector that's continuing to muddle through in various different ways. If I talk briefly about oil, gas, coal, and nuclear here in turn, and then I'll try to say a few words about some wider implications. In the oil sector, I think we see Russia kind of largely having rearranged its export relationships to an extent that I think perhaps surprised some in the United States. That's not without costs. It's not without inefficiencies. The price cap and other measures certainly are having an impact. But Russia has largely succeeded in redirecting its oil flows. The picture in natural gas, far more complicated, very sharp decline in Russian natural gas exports due to the loss of exports to Europe. ultimately resulting really from a Russian decision preemptively to shut that down in an effort to apply pressure to Europe, something that didn't really succeed. And Russia, for its part, not having the infrastructure that it needs to make up those exports elsewhere, either through pipelines or through liquefied natural gas. Coal, a picture somewhat more similar to oil in the sense that, you know, Russia has managed to reorient its exports. Last year, actually, a very large share of the coal that used to go to Europe went to the United Arab Emirates instead. But the coal sector, which is largely privatized, faces huge economic pressures on one hand from higher taxes and on the other hand from higher rail tariffs. As you know, Russia reorients much of its international trade, there are higher value products that are increasingly competing with coal for access to the limited Russian rail system. And looking ahead, that's kind of posing some significant challenges, I expect, for the coal sector. Where nuclear is concerned, you know, certainly the nuclear fuel market, where Russia has about 46% of global enrichment capacity. Russia really has faced very little pressure so far, largely due to that market being fairly inelastic, and the United States and our allies in Europe and others kind of depending on access at this point to Russian enriched uranium. Finland canceled a reactor project, but you know, Russia's other reactor construction projects are moving forward. In the paper, I try to dig into implications of this over the next 5 to 10 years for the United States, and I'll try to highlight four just very quickly, very quickly, because we have limited time. One, you know, the Russian economy certainly is stagnating. It's not collapsing. And from a political perspective, that means that efforts to apply political pressure to Russia via economic pressure on the energy sector are not yet succeeding, and we may need to come up with some new ideas if that's something we want to do in the future. Secondly, I think we really need to think hard about the implications of Russia reordering its energy relationships. You know, we spent decades, really many decades, extending back into the Cold War, worrying about Russia's energy relationship with Europe and Europe's dependence on Russia. And I don't think we've really started thinking too much about the consequences of the new energy relationships that Russia is building, whether that's with China or with India or in the mineral sector in Africa. You know, if we start looking toward the energy transition and some of the mineral needs. Thirdly, you know, on our allies, you know, our allies, and here I would stress not only our allies in Europe, but also our allies in Asia, Japan and South Korea in particular. Our allies are also facing challenges, particularly on the natural gas side. LNG prices became quite high. In Europe, you know, the lack of access to gas is having a lot of longer term consequences for industry. In Japan and Korea, the high prices had some pretty significant consequences for electric utilities and others providing electricity. We should really be thinking about the role that the United States can play in helping to deliver additional gas to our allies. And more than that, our sanctions policy, and here I'm focused especially on Russia's Arctic LNG projects. Our sanctions policy is intended to delay those projects. And if we delay those projects, but then don't make use of the time that we're creating by delaying them, by developing our own projects, the sanctions are likely to be much less effective. Finally, I think we should think a lot about technology and Russia's reliance on technology from others. In the past, Russia relied very heavily on the United States and the West for technology in its energy sector. That technology is no longer available. Russia will certainly try to develop many indigenous technologies and may succeed in some areas at least well enough. But Russia will also be looking very much to others, especially to China for technology. That deepening relationship, I think, is also one that we should keep a very close eye on. Perhaps I'll stop there. I went on a little longer than I hoped, but thank you for your indulgence.
Great, Paul. Thank you. It was an excellent tour d'horizon from your excellent paper. Let me turn now to Tatiana, and if there's some points she would like to pick up. I think this question of technology, given your experience on the board of Schlumberger, what's your sense of the Russian industry's ability to sustain itself long term, and particularly open up the northern areas, which they have been relying on very much Western technology?
Okay, thank you, Robin, for this introduction. And I'm really very proud and happy to be here on this panel. First of all, Paul, it's a great paper, and I really strongly recommend everyone to read it carefully. It's not that long, but it's very rich, and I assume it's the first attempt to really provide a comprehensive analysis of all the new developments. Normally, people, including myself, are writing about oil, are writing about gas, about renewables, but here it is all put into perspective, and it really gives a lot of food for thought. For me, at least, I've really enjoyed reading it. So to your question, Robin, on the technology and let's say sustainability of the Russian oil and gas industry, I would say it's rather resilient. And the fact that Russia proves and supports OPEC plus production cuts, it actually allows it to avoid the most expensive and technologically challenging developments and upstream investments. So basically, this peak oil production, which everyone was expecting to come like in 2023, 2024, now it's being postponed. And yes, there are some developments which cannot be carried out without Western technologies like Arctic offshore drilling. But there are not so many projects like that in Russia, and basically Russian oil industry can quite easily function without them, just going for more intensive development of the onshore fields. Arctic is not a problem. 30% of Russian oil is already produced in Arctic. And by the way, 80% of Russian gas is produced in Arctic environment with conventional technologies, with either domestic or Chinese equipment. So it can be handled without any stress or drama. And it is important to keep it in mind. I mean, I want to go very briefly through the points which Paul has raised, his major conclusions on the state of Russian economy and energy sector. Paul mentioned that economy is stagnating. I mean, not actually. For the first quarter of 2024, Russian GDP growth was 7.6% year on year. It's not stagnation. It's a very strange growth. It's a military-driven growth of overheated economy with very low level of unemployment and with huge share of state expenditures. It's a good question for how long this hysterical growth can be sustained. It's not definitely resulting in increased level of life of the population. It's not creating value, but it is working 24/7. So the economy is on its rise, actually. The international relationship, as Paul mentioned, it's not only China, India, Africa. I think it was also an extremely successful attempt to build an alliance with OPEC, and it helped a lot. Actually, if we are looking at the Russian oil revenues, there is a very huge share which actually results from this arrangement. And this joint game with OPEC countries, it allows Russia to sustain its revenues, and it also shows this very diverse geography. So it's Middle East, it's Asia, it's Africa, it's actually Latin America to a certain extent. So Russia is targeting at building alliances very much similar to what Soviet Union did with the global South. And so far, it seems to be, I mean, these countries, they have quite opportunistic position. So it's difficult to say that India or China are supporting Russia, or its geopolitical movements. But they are definitely happy to benefit from cheaper hydrocarbons and other incentives that Russia is ready to provide them, including nuclear reactors and so on. It's energy here is becoming a tool for international competition and for getting new alliances of non-aligned against the West. And it has to be kept in mind that similarly to how Russia was using gas weapon in relationship with Europe, it will try to use all the other energy resources in order to tie up with the non-Western countries. So this geopolitical dimension is very important. And also, I mean, when we are talking about US allies, who are facing challenges indeed with the high gas prices last year, no longer actually now gas prices are at very comfortable level. But they are feeling pain and they start to complain. If you talk to the European industrial enterprises in the coffee breaks, they will tell you, oh my God, if our governments would allow, we would start importing Russian gas today. Or if you look at what Japan is doing with the LNG imports and with all the applications for exemptions from the sanctions, you see it's very difficult for them to sustain this confrontation for a long time, and it's an additional challenge to the consistency of the Western policy regarding Russia, including sanctions policy. And then the issue of reliance of technology, with which you, Robin, started your question. Yes, this dependency was critical before 2014. After the annexation of Crimea and the first round of sanctions, it started already to reduce because Russian authorities and Russian oil and gas companies realized that actually it's not something that can be granted. They started to invest enormous money for import replacement. It didn't work well. Half of money just disappeared, but nevertheless, the desire was already there. And starting from 2022, the situation became completely desperate. So these efforts are now much more efficient. They include both import replacement domestically, but also building ties with Chinese, Indian, Middle Eastern equipment manufacturers and suppliers. And I would say at the moment, it seems that there is basically no critical energy equipment left, which cannot be either produced domestically or obtained, except for, surprise, surprise, the Arctic class tankers. So this is something that so far Russian companies didn't manage to replace. As for the rest, they are doing quite well. And I think the very last point, I understand that I'm already taking too much time, but I really want to mention it because it's in the title of your report, Paul. It's energy transition. So Russia has never been like a leader of the energy transition or climate discussion, though in 2021, just before the war, it has taken these net zero commitments and it started to develop decarbonization strategy and support to the renewables and all this hydrogen discussion and so on. Obviously, during the war, it's not on the priority list of the government, but still all the commitments are there and the formal discussion is still there. And basically, what I can see from the public discussion in Russia, the idea is to use it also as a tool for international expansion and for getting on board all these non-aligned countries. So just imagine, let's say, Indonesia, Central Africa, Nigeria, you name it. Rosatom is coming with the proposal to build nuclear reactor plus wind farm, plus hydrogen production, and also educate your people and providing governmental loan. That looks already quite interesting and attractive. So you see, the point I'm making is that energy transition, though we will hardly see any breakthroughs in decarbonization in Russia domestically, but for the international expansion, it will definitely use it. Thank you.
Great. Well, that was another tour d'horizon. We're touring the world here. That was excellent. Craig, what thoughts do you have?
Thank you very much, and thank you again for including me today. And I would echo the sentiments that Tatiana and Robin have already made about the superb paper that Paul has put out. It is something which, back before the 1990s, we used to see these comprehensive tours of the Russian energy sector, but they've largely fallen away since then. So it's very welcome what Paul has produced, and I highly recommend it to everyone. And the Center for the National Interest should be commended for supporting his work on this as well. So I'd like to offer perhaps a slightly different perspective on what's going on in Russia, one that perhaps has a bit more of a finance spin to it, since that's my background, finance and industry. We've heard Paul talk about the economy as stagnating. We've heard Tatiana talk about GDP figures as suggesting that you have a resilient economy, although one that perhaps is overheating because of excessive investment in the military industry. I think this concept of surprising resilience is one that has really captured the headlines. And I want to offer a slightly different perspective, because how Russia's economy looks depends on what you're looking at. So if you're a macroeconomist, you're looking at a lot of the headline numbers. You're looking at GDP, you're looking at inflation, you're looking at FX, you're looking at the key interest rate, which, by the way, is at 16%, which already gives you a signal that perhaps not all is well in the economy. But if you are a finance guy and you're interested in the industry, you want to get beyond the dashboard and you want to look underneath the hood and see how the key industrial sectors are actually performing today and what the overall trajectory is. And when you do that, and I'm going to focus just on oil and gas, I don't have the comprehensive mastery that Paul does of the other energy sectors. But when you do that and you look back at the general trajectory in Russia over the last 25 years, the trends look poor across the piece. I think what we see is actually surprising distress in the economy. Things are more distressed in the oil and gas sector than I would have anticipated that they would be, given the very light touch sanctions that have been put in place so far on oil and gas. And let me just pause on that for a moment. There was a lot of anticipation on both sides. By that, I mean among coalition partners on one hand and on the Russian side for financial sanctions. Since 2014, both sides have been thinking about how they might play out. And Russia was quite well prepared for financial sanctions once they came into play. And I would add that the financial sanctions themselves were not nearly as sweeping as many of us might have thought. We did indeed de-SWIFT part of the banking system, but the most important part, the part that manages the oil and gas trade, wasn't touched at all. In fact, we went out of our way to say we will not touch the trade flows, even today, around oil and gas. We'll allow them to continue to settle through the SWIFT system. On the other hand, energy sanctions caught everybody by surprise. If you remember back 2 years ago, and a little bit more to February and March, the signals coming out of Europe and Washington were oil is going to go ahead as before. We won't go after that. Gas, we certainly won't touch. But that changed. It changed primarily in Europe, and primarily when the atrocities around Bucha and Irpin were disclosed in April of 2022. And the Europeans suddenly said, while we'll continue to buy gas, we just cannot in good conscience continue to buy Russian oil. And they started to move toward full embargo on imports and a full embargo on the use of transportation as well. And this caught everybody by surprise, Washington and Moscow. And ever since then, it's been a scramble to try to improvise both on Russia's side and on the West. The price cap actually was an effort to soften the impact of European sanctions to allow Russian volumes to stay in the market. In fact, India was an essential part of that because that was the only market that could possibly absorb the amount of oil that was going to be diverted from Europe. And that's in fact what happened. And indeed, the parties who actually brokered the first shipments to India were Western trading companies. They eventually were forced out of the crude trade and handed over to this new crop of sort of unknown third-tier companies. But all of this was actually, in a way, it's trying to encourage stability in the global energy trade. Gas wasn't being touched, oil volumes weren't being touched. The one thing that we were focused on was how can the West, or how can the coalition reduce revenues going to Russia and raise costs? And that's really been the focus since then. And it's been a very restrained and measured focus. Some people would say overly cautious, as it were. Nonetheless, when you look under the hood and you look at the different sectors, subsectors within the oil and gas industry, you see a surprising level of distress. I'll start with refining. We've all, of course, seen the drone strikes. But what I think people have focused on less has been the fact that 40 of the top 40 refineries in Russia, all over the last 25 years, have installed a huge amount of advanced distillation capacity from Western equipment suppliers. They can no longer get the spare parts. They can no longer get the servicing. And we're starting to see that infrastructure degrade just from natural attrition. I'd point to, say, the North Sea refinery, one of the most complex refineries in Russia. They lost part of their distillation capability just through attrition, no drone strikes, for gasoline production, and caused an 11% drop in overall gasoline output in Russia. So there's degradation going on there. Paul talked about LNG, as did Tatiana. Russia, it was relatively late in the game that LNG sanctions were put in place, but Russia has struggled both with liquefaction as well as transportation on its own. It hadn't really prepared nearly to the extent that you might have thought. We could even talk about the shadow fleet itself. Russia didn't think it would need to rely on its own tanker fleet. It had the ability on the eve of the full-scale invasion to move about 15% of its oil, seaborne oil. The rest was going through primarily coalition-owned or coalition-insured tankers. They then thought perhaps we'll be able to poach some tankers from the Iran and the Venezuela trade, but it didn't work out that way. they ended up having to go into the secondhand market and spend the better part of $9 billion to build up the shadow fleet capacity. Now, where have they gotten to? They still aren't even at 50% of the total capacity that they need to keep the oil flow going to places like India and China. The rest is still coming from coalition tankers. And the shadow fleet itself has an average age of 18 years, which means that over the next 2 to 3 years, all 8 billion of those, 9 billion of those tankers are going to reach their natural service life and have to be replaced. On top of all of that, OFAC has started to use its designation capability on just a small number of them, 40 tankers in all. But the 40 shadow tankers that it's put on its designation list have all immediately fallen out of service because nobody wants to touch them. So yes, Russia has been responding, but the overall trajectory is one of an industry which is in increasing levels of distress. And I would say no more so than the gas sector and Gasprom in particular. So one of the first deals I worked on as a young banker was the Gasprom IPO in 1996. And back then, the fundamental agreement that was in place is still the one that's in place today. Gasprom has a monopoly to Europe. It makes a huge amount of money there, and that cross-subsidizes below-cost energy within Russia itself. So Gasprom provides 2/3 of Russia's domestic gas. Gas is 50% of the Russian energy base, and it's all below cost, or much of it is below cost, and much cheaper than international gas prices. But that was only possible because of this massive cross-subsidy from Europe. And so it was really surprising to those of us who'd followed Gasprom for years that Putin would decide to bet the farm and use the gas weapon in hopes that he would be able to pressure the Europeans into backing away from Ukraine. But it backfired. We all focus on how much the cost of resisting that blackmail has been to Europe, and it's been substantial, and we need to stay focused on that. But what we haven't looked at is what the cost for Russia has been. You've seen a collapse in the overall revenues for the gas business, so much so that Gasprom, this titan of energy, 20% of Russia's revenues, the federal budget revenues in 2022 came from Gasprom, the largest taxpayer. It's now battling with insolvency. It doesn't actually have enough revenues to cover all of its costs. And I just focus on financing costs to begin with. So Gasprom carries almost $70 billion in debt. Much of that was foreign, but it's now all having to be refinanced in Russia's rather thin domestic debt markets. Now, what's Gazprom's borrowing cost on this $70 billion as it refinances? It's 17.5%. That's what they have to pay to domestic lenders. And they're going to struggle to get all of that refinanced. But even if they do, their annual finance cost is going to be 90% of their total domestic revenues. That's just for the interest on their debt. So this is unsustainable, and something is going to have to give. I mean, we talk about building pipelines to China, et cetera, but where's the money going to come from? And I would add, where are the compressors going to come from? Because Russia is still heavily dependent on Western compressors. And the Chinese are not the solution, because the Chinese too don't have the compressor technology to be able to make this new pipeline work. So these are all things, when you get away from the dashboard and you look under the hood, you start seeing distress all over the place. And it's only likely to get worse going forward. So just a moment about the Asia versus Europe trade-off. Europe, it has been a partner with Russia since the 1870s in developing its oil and gas business, and gas since the 1960s. And it offers three critical things that Russia hasn't been able to get yet from Asia. Number one is a premium marketplace. The pricing is just so much better in Europe. You have lower transportation costs and you get premium pricing, especially on natural gas. Plus, you can integrate downstream. Gasprom was all over Europe, storage, transportation. You could even get your home gas supply in the UK from Gasprom. They're not going to have any of those opportunities in the Chinese marketplace. It's very transactional. You sell at the border and goodbye. So you don't have the premium market. Then there's the technology. Tatjana is absolutely right. There is a lot of technology that you can get from China, But the technologies that Russia most needs, and it's the reason why Schlumberger is still in Russia, because it alone can provide them. These are the technologies that Russia needs for those more difficult to develop greenfield projects and its declining brownfield projects. These are advanced telemetry systems for drilling. These are advanced reservoir simulation systems. You can't get those from China. They just don't have them. They get them from the coalition countries, the US and Europe in particular, and so does Russia. So that's a real issue again going forward. Russia almost has to embrace OPEC cuts because of the challenges and the expenses involved in continuing to maintain higher levels of output. Now, if Schlumberger were to leave tomorrow, I agree with Tatiana, Russia could keep its production where it is today and even push production up, but the cost will be higher. And the higher the costs, the heavier the toll on the economy overall. I think that the final thing I would say, in addition to technology and the premium market for Asia, is you don't have the risk capital. China, of course, as we know, has immense amount of capital available, but it's invested in a very different way from European capital. It's primarily to support Chinese companies doing Chinese projects overseas. Europe is a risk capital. It's a portfolio capital and private equity driven type of financing, which is exactly what Russia was looking for. There was $725 billion in foreign debt, most of it European, for Russia on the eve of the 2014 Crimean annexation. And that's declined dramatically. You're not going to see those sorts of numbers coming out of Asia anytime soon. So I think in summary then, the dashboard has some positive indicators, some worrying indicators flashing red. You look under the hood, you see greater distress in the engine room. And in terms of the Europe versus the Asia swap, I would say the reason why Russia stuck with Europe for so long was it was just such a good deal. Asia is very much a consolation prize. There will be advantages over time that come from that, but it's still not optimal for Russia. And I'll pause with that. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, that was frankly a terrific discussion. Tatiana, do you want to respond at all to this? Do you agree with what Craig said?
Look, I think what we provided together with Craig and what actually Paul has managed to highlight in his report just perfectly is this balance. Yeah, because you remember this saying, I think first Talleyrand and then Churchill said that Russia is never as strong as it seems and never as weak as it seems. So this is probably the perfect description of the situation. Yes, it proved to be much more resilient than many experts were expecting. And yes, most likely for the next several years, maybe 5 years, it's difficult to say, it will not face dramatic problems with the oil and gas industry specifically and with the oil and gas production and exports. But at the same time, first of all, the sanctions do work and they do create pain and they do increase costs. I completely agree with Craig. And all these technological issues, they are not dramatic right now, but they will accumulate with time, month after month. Yeah, and at a certain point, this quantity will move into quality and it will really lead to some more painful consequences. But it's not immediate effect. You remember the discussion in 2022, like sanctions should undermine Russia's military machine and remove this financial capability. The sanctions cannot do it right now. Yeah, so we are talking about much longer term perspective. At the same time, these capital constraints, I think, yes, I agree partially. I think that all these state funding that is accumulated in Russia right now, it will be used for the oil and gas industry at a certain point. And moreover, something which we, Robin, actually started to discuss before this webinar, there are profound changes, hidden but nevertheless very strong ongoing among Russian elites. There is this fight between different elite groups. And we see already nationalization ongoing in the Russian economy. It started with the Western assets, but now it is already applied to the Russian private companies, so far in the military sector, but I think it will be expanded to the energy sector as well. So there is this logics in the militarized economy, which wants to get much more centralized, to increase state control and so on. Oil and gas sector cannot avoid these dynamics. So we will see, I assume, a lot of changes in the corporate landscape in here and in the, let's say, leadership landscape. I would say the changes in top management of Gazprom Neft are probably the best illustration of this process, which started already, and I think more to follow.
Great. This question comes up, which seems to me as of central importance from people in Washington, is relations between Russia and China in the gas business. That's the heart of really the future. I mean, the oil business is relatively stable, but the gas business, having lost the European market, and the difficulty of the Chinese market, and the Chinese don't have the capital, they don't want to pay for it. It strikes me, is this, are the Russians comfortable basically plighting their troth to the Chinese for the foreseeable future? When you build multi-billion-dollar gas pipeline systems, those are long-term commitments. And there's a long history of a Russian and Chinese skepticism of each other. And the Chinese, they'll take the gas, but they don't want to pay for it. So it strikes me that both Tatiana and Craig, this question of China is really very central. Craig, your thoughts?
Sure. So I agree with you on the oil front. If we look at the shift of Europe, of both coalition oil from Europe, but also from Asia, China did increase its intake of Russian oil by maybe 15%. But the bulk of it ended up going into India, because that's where the real demand was. And China, of course, has limits on the amount it will take from any single supplier, and it's pretty much at its limits for Russia now. So that leaves the gas side of things. And again, I say, you can look at the dashboard, but it's really important to actually kind of get out and measure things and understand what the real impact is going to be. In a best case scenario, Russian additional gas to China might flow in the early 2030s. And it will only be after a major investment in pipelines, compressors for which we don't know where they'll come from. And somebody has to finance these tens of billions of dollars. Gasprom certainly can't afford it. It's asking for the government to bail it out. But let's just say it gets built, and we look at the quantities that they're talking about, and we look at the pricing based on what we see already into China. We're talking about maybe replacing a sixth, maybe a fifth of the lost European revenues 10 years out. I mean, that hardly moves the needle in terms of restoring Gazprom to the type of engine of the Russian economy that it once was. And if you think about the next consequences, if China isn't the solution, there's no other place to take this gas, what's Russia going to have to do? Ultimately, it needs to raise domestic prices. But that's going to have and Gazprom, by the way, has already asked for liberalization of gas prices from the government. The government said, are you crazy? We've got interest rates at 16% already to try and tamp down inflation. That would be highly inflationary. We can't do that. So again, the consequences of the decision to go to war with a country that is trying to partner with your most important marketplace in energy for technology, capital, and premium market, and thinking that that's not going to have a consequence on your energy industry, just strikes me as really bad strategy. And I think, you go to anybody in the senior management in Gazprom today, and I cannot imagine that they're happy with what's happened. And one person made the decision to do this, and it messed up. And there's a series of decisions now that the Kremlin's been making, which are damaging the energy industry that they've taken 25 years to build up. And the energy elite all see this. And Putin knows he's messed up, and he knows they see it. So this creates another interesting dynamic among the elites. But I'll sort of pause with that comment because I'm sure Tatiana and Paul have interesting things to say.
Yeah, you know, actually, if I might, you know, Craig has heard me say this before, but let me read 6 sentences from Vladimir Putin in his address to Russia's parliament in 2018. The speed of technological progress is accelerating sharply. It is rising dramatically. Those who manage to ride this technological wave will surge far ahead. Those who fail to do this will be submerged and would drown in this wave. Technological lag and dependence translate into reduced security and economic opportunities of the country and ultimately the loss of its sovereignty. This is the way things stand now in 2018 when he said that. This lag inevitably weakens and erodes human potential because new jobs, modern companies, and an attractive life will develop in other more successful countries where educated and talented young people will go, thereby draining the society's vital powers and development energy. Okay, so he said that in 2018. And he's decided to go to war in 2022, and he decided to replace technological dependence on a large constellation of Western countries and Western companies with technological dependence largely on a single country where a lot of the companies are state-owned or controlled. You know, I think that's terrible for Russia. I think it has profound long-term implications for Russia. Actually, I also happen to think it's bad for the United States, actually, for Russia to be that dependent on China. So that's my short contribution.
Tatiana.
So, yeah, with pleasure. So, look, first of all, on several points that Craig mentioned regarding your initial question about power of Siberia 2 and Russian gas exports to China, China is not ready so far to accept this gas. And it seems that the reason is not actually price negotiation, but rather, as it was with Power of Siberia 1 back in 2014, but rather the desire of China not to get politically compromised by something which could be regarded as a strategic alliance with Russia during the hottest phase of the war. So my impression is that China is just waiting for some sort of ceasefire or, well, not peace agreement, but at least some sort of temporary settlement of the active military actions. And then having Russian gas as an option, not necessarily as a firm contract, but something that can be used if needed with a flexibility. I think China wouldn't refuse from such a possibility. And what it means, I mean, Gasprom will definitely take state money to finance it. Yeah, so no doubt. It will, I mean, compressors are an issue, but they can actually take compressors from Nord Stream, from Yamal Europe, and from the other capacities which are now idle in the European part of Russia and simply move them there. I mean, don't underestimate creative thinking of the Russian companies which find themselves cornered. They can be very creative. But then, I mean, just imagine if China is receiving these additional volumes of Russian pipeline gas. Don't forget about Turkmenistan, Myanmar, all the extensive LNG portfolio which Chinese companies managed already to contract. That's too much for the Chinese domestic market. And it's the criticism which I hear quite frequently from many analysts who are saying, "Come on, China will not contract this for this deal because it doesn't need this additional gas." But if you take a look at the activity of the Chinese trading houses, yeah, and it might be really quite an interesting attempt from the Chinese side to really build up an alternative to Western traders and to really take sort of more influential position in this international oil trade and gas trade and coal trade, having Russia as a sort of backup capacity, yeah, nearly unlimited source of rather cheap hydrocarbons, which would mean quite a different global energy order as long as we are still in the early days of energy transition, not at the final destination point, and hydrocarbons do really matter for all the countries. So there could be a more sophisticated game behind this. But anyway, I completely agree with Craig and with Paul that starting this war was by definition sacrificing Gasprom as an engine of economic growth. So it will no longer be able to generate such amounts of money, sacrificing the future technological leadership of Russia with the brain drain, with the I mean, Russian scientists are now isolated from the rest of the world, and in the when we are talking about AI or about any other new technologies, it's impossible to develop them in complete isolation. So there is a lot of things which were sacrificed in addition to the people's lives, but that was a purely geopolitical decision to do so, unfortunately.
Let me ask, we have a question from the outside from Martin Zubko. There's some talks about Russia's natural gas being used to produce hydrogen and then exported as a new Russian energy commodity. What's your take on this?
I'm profoundly skeptical of that. That's my short answer.
Yeah, I was involved in the discussion before the war, and there were indeed several dozens of projects, both blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. So oil and gas companies, Gazprom, Novatek, Rosneft were very much interested in producing hydrogen with CCUS. The major power companies, including Western, like Fortum, like Enel, they were looking very seriously at green hydrogen production from the wind farms. Germany specifically was very much interested in importing this hydrogen one day. There were very serious discussions, very well advanced with Japan on hydrogen imports from Sakhalin. So there were some signs of activities, but basically all of these projects, they are possible only in a very close cooperation in consortiums, building supply chain with the Western or Far Eastern consumers. So you cannot do it alone. Yeah, neither from the technology side nor from the finance side. Yeah, and you definitely need an offtake for this hydrogen. You cannot just sell it in the open market because it simply doesn't exist so far. So since the war started, all of these projects they were cancelled. There is still this mentioning of hydrogen exports in the Russian energy strategy, and the energy ministry keeps saying that yes, we have this target. They've reduced the volumes of projected hydrogen exports from 4 million tons by 2030 to, I believe, less than 1 million ton, which is still, I mean, I'm also skeptical, Paul. I don't think that it will be achieved. But basically, it's, I assume, another sacrifice, another opportunity which was lost with this war.
Let me change gears a little bit. We have a question. Do you want to comment on this?
Just really briefly, I agree with everything Paul and Tatiana have just said, and Tatiana summed it up brilliantly. The one observation I would make is that, again, the technology and the market and the financing were all primarily based around the European discussion. This was Russia's great transition play, the hydrogen. And China is not driving the hydrogen agenda, certainly nowhere in the way that Western Europe was. And again, we get back to the infrastructure issues, et cetera. They might be interested in the technology, but they're not interested in buying a lot of hydrogen from Russia.
Okay, let me change gears here. We've talked about China a lot. We haven't talked much about India, which is a very important factor. I have a question from Vivek Prasad. What do you think, how Russia is going to manage both China and India, who is anti-China, on this issue, since India has a good relationship with the West? How's Russia going to balance between the Chinese and the Indians, and do they have to balance between them?
I'm not sure that they necessarily have to. I think on energy matters, China and India are both fairly transactional, and I'm not sure that they're really going to be in either case sort of looking to who Russia's other customers are and becoming concerned about that. I think for me the wider the wider question is, particularly in the Indian case, if the deeper energy relationship starts to broaden into other areas, then does that pose challenges in the Russia-China relationship, or for that matter in the U.S.-India relationship?
Yeah, I agree with Paul. If I may, very, very quickly, Russia before the war was always trying to balance between China and India, and I think there was an extremely interesting leakage. Well, actually, it was provided to the court against Russian Ministry of Economic Development, Ulukayev. Yeah, Igor Sechin was witnessing, and all his conversation with Ulukayev was disclosed. And during this conversation, basically, Sechin was saying that we need to balance Chinese with Indians. So it was very clear. Right now, the relationship is purely transactional, so I don't think that it is creating any need for balancing. But if in the future, when hopefully the conflict will move from this hottest stage to sort of a ceasefire, at least, when the issue of potential upstream investments or any equity participation of Chinese and Indian companies will come back to the agenda, which is not now. Yeah, but then the question who will be controlling Russian crown jewels, yeah, so the best assets, it might create this confrontation and these disputes and maybe some additional pressure from China, but we are really very far away from this point at the moment.
Paul and company, I make it 9:59. Does anybody have any comments they want to wrap up with?
I have one final one on my mind about nuclear, and I mentioned that we haven't put a lot of sanctions in place on nuclear so far. I think that could change over time as we start to deal with the fuel supply question and some of the projects where both Russian and Western companies are participating in construction, as they move to completion. I'm quite concerned about the possibility that we put a lot of sanctions on Rosatom and kind of knock it out of international markets or damage its competitiveness in international markets without getting our own act together to export reactors and fuel ourselves. Because if we do that, China has been building dozens of reactors. They've got their technology down, they've got their supply chains down, they're going to have very competitive offerings much in the way that Rosatom does, as kind of a state-driven process. And I think there's a big risk if we don't get our act together that we kind of damage Rosatom and then turn that market over to Chinese firms internationally.
Do either of you have any closing comments here?
Tatiana, go ahead.
Yeah, well, maybe I will extend the idea which Paul mentioned. So when we are talking about the global implications and especially implications for the energy transition of this whole real mess, something which we couldn't imagine just, let's say, 3-4 years ago, the biggest energy producer in the world, if you put together oil, gas, coal, uranium, getting under the strictest ever sanctions and becoming isolated from the West. So in this situation, when we are looking at the rest of the world, first of all at China, India, and especially at the poorest developing countries, the way the value proposition that Russia is making now, which is cheap, abundant hydrocarbons without all these methane footprint, carbon footprint, just forget about it. Just transferring this crude oil ship to ship in the middle of the night with transponders switched off. Nobody cares about environmental consequences. Yeah, it's just oil. Yeah. So it is really quite attractive for the poorest countries, which are struggling with their energy poverty, with energy deficit. And at the same time, when the West starts to talk to them, the value proposition is about solar, about hydrogen, about all these fancy things which are not that appealing and which are not solving their immediate needs. Yeah, so it's probably looking like a marshmallow test, which many countries are not able to stand. I'm observing this happening already in Central Asia when Russia is actually contracting for the construction of new coal-fired plants in Kazakhstan or refurbishing refineries in Turkmenistan. And look how quickly these countries are changing their rhetorics regarding the war. So it is an influential tool and it is a message to the West, let's say, not to forget about hydrocarbons, which are still extremely important in their conversation with the rest of the world.
I think that's an excellent point. Well, I think the U.S. is failing the global South, particularly in the energy area, and making it more difficult, not less difficult. Anyway, I think that's an excellent point. Craig?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that point because I think it's an important point as well. But tied back into an earlier comment that Tatiana was making about OPEC, because I think the OPEC story is one of the most interesting things that's happened over the last 20 years with Russian energy. Russia had been resisting overtures from OPEC on and off, really going back to the oil price collapse at the end of the 1990s, early 2000s. And it was only after the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014 that it finally felt compelled to join forces to try to manage the market with OPEC. But there are real tensions there, and we saw those tensions come to the fore in the first half of 2023 when Russia was shifting huge amounts of Urals to India. It had one real buyer of last resort, and the Indians were doing what they should do. They were bargaining really aggressively and imposing these deep discounts on Russia for Urals. Now, those discounts actually were pulling oil prices down across the region. OPEC was suffering, but it was to the benefit of everyone in India. It has been great for the Indian economy, and for that matter, anyone anywhere else who's buying oil. These sanctions have, ironically, actually helped to dampen oil prices. It was only once OPEC really put the pressure on Russia back in the summer of 2023 that Russia finally agreed to cut. It did squeeze the discount, and it looks like the partnership is sort of back in order again. But I would caution that the tensions are still there. And there is one scenario where you could see those tensions really rise and challenge the ability of Russia to collaborate with OPEC. And it's the following. And then the price cap, very novel, lots of teething pains. And there's still major adjustments to be made to make it work effectively. But if those adjustments do get made, say after the election in the US, depending on how things go, and we see the price cap become a more effective tool, you could actually see Russia forced to make a decision between cutting some of its production that it refuses to sell at a lower price cap level, or reverting to what it was doing in the first half of last year, and that was volume over value. They were pushing as much oil out as they could. And if they go in that direction, it is fundamentally opposed to collaboration with OPEC. So if the price cap starts to bite and Russia has to choose between whether they want to cut a lot of their production to try and cause a supply spike, or simply maximize their export volumes. If they go the latter way, that's going to cause a real tension with OPEC. And so I think that's something to watch going forward.
Okay, well, my schedule shows it's a 1 hour time slot, and we've already run over. There are a couple of other really very good questions. What sanction would really make Putin stop and think would hurt? Also, this whole question of the role of Russian energy in the developing world and with the BRIC countries, and that's a whole nother. There's lots to explore. This is a big subject. Let me close by thanking everybody. I thought these were really excellent discussion, but I would like to close on the note: read Paul's paper if you haven't. It's excellent. It really is a very thoughtful paper.
Thank you.
Paul, do you have anything?
No. Thank you. Thank you very much to everyone for participating in this Center for the National Interest Energy Innovation and Reform Project discussion. The paper is on the Energy Innovation Reform Project website, innovationreform.org. So thank you so much. Thank you.
So everybody, Craig, Tatiana, Paul, thank you so much. And I have a feeling we're going to hear more on this subject. Thanks so much. Take care.